Hello and welcome to Connect. I'm your host, Randy Shabilo. On today's show, we'll have archaeologist Dr. Terence Clark from the University of Saskatchewan talking about the project he's working on at the Nutana Pioneer Cemetery in Saskatoon. And as always, we'd like to connect with you. Follow us on Facebook to watch new and past interviews or email us at connectyxe@gmail.com. University of Saskatchewan's Dr. Terence Clark is with us today, and he's going to shed some light on the project that's underway currently at the Nutana Pioneer Cemetery. Dr. Clark, thanks for taking a little bit of time out of your schedule and shedding some light on this project. I think it's fascinating when we just heard about it here yesterday through the Heritage Advisory Committee and some of the things I've read about what you're undertaking. Can you shed some light on your role at the university and what it is you do and the interest you have in this?
Sure. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan in the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology. I've got a number of research interests. My principal project is a collaborative research initiative with the Shoshone Nation in Sechelt, BC. But I'm also working on a number of things in Saskatchewan, focused on Indigenous graves principally. And so I've been using a number of technologies, including ground penetrating radar, which we'll talk about in the Nutana context, to try to find where graves are so that they can be better protected in the future.
So when we look at our Nutana Cemetery, that was Saskatoon's first cemetery that I believe started in about the late 1880s to 1909. What are you going to do, and have you done so far?
So our goals are twofold right now. I'm teaching a course in digital archaeology, sort of these new techniques, the new technologies in archaeology, to some undergraduate students. And so they're out there this week learning about how to use these, the ground penetrating radar and photogrammetry and some others. And we're also really interested in helping the city. There are a number of unmarked graves at the cemetery due to erosion events in the past. A number of graves that were located along the bank edge were dug up and moved to the central part of the cemetery. And the records for where those were put are really sparse. And so we can use the technology. We don't need to dig anything up. We can just go over the ground surface, and our radar will tell us where those graves are, and we can let the city know where they are, and they can get put on maps and things like that.
We also heard a little bit about any opportunity for some DNA recovery that is possible. Is that something that you're planning or could do elsewhere as well?
Yes, we're investigating the idea of using environmental DNA with our partners at Stantec. And so what this is essentially a small little device. It kind of looks like something from Star Trek. It's like a cell phone. And what you need to do is just put a sample in, and it can identify the various species present. And so what we'd like to test out are taking a very small diameter soil probe and pushing that into the earth next to a grave. And so not above a grave, but next to one. And our belief is that we'll be able to identify human DNA in the soil, and that will help us line up all of these different ways of looking at graveyards. And so the ground penetrating radar is going to give us an impression of what's under the ground. We're also using magnetometry, or electromagnetometry, which is another technique to look at disturbances under the ground. We want to line those up with the GPR, and then we're going to use satellite imagery to look at changes in vegetation, and then the eDNA. And our goal is that we want to be as accurate as possible in making these identifications, especially when it comes to children, infants, and babies. Those ones are much, much smaller and much closer to the surface, and therefore they're much harder to find. And if we can line up all of these techniques and be very comfortable with our results, then we can move to other contexts, like the Indian residential schools, the missing children of the Indian residential school era, where we have unmarked graves and unmarked cemeteries. And then we can go through and use these techniques to very accurately locate the locations of those children without ever having to dig.
I think that's fascinating in the sense that you're bringing that onto the larger discussion and project. Is this a Canada-wide initiative, or is it starting here? Is the technology in its infancy, or is it pretty well defined and developed right now?
There are a number of archaeologists and researchers across the country using ground penetrating radar to look for missing children. Recently, the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada has taken the lead on this project and is mapping out a national strategy to look at all 150 Indian residential schools, many of which have unmarked graves. And so I'm working as part of a big team to figure out how we can do this best, both in terms of the science, but also respecting community wishes, working with each community. There's going to be, a huge variety across the country of how they want to, share information and work with us, and have their beliefs respected. And so it's quite the project, but we want to do everything that we can to help it.
Can you take this to different communities if you're looking at around the provinces and doing this type of work? Can you utilize that in some way where you think there may have been settlements or burials that have taken place, I would imagine, in the last 100 years or so? But even beyond that, would that still be able to be recovered from something that may have happened 200 or 300 years ago?
Yes, this technology is quite versatile. So it's not actually looking for the burial. It's not looking for the bones or the skeleton or anything like that. What it does is look for disturbances in the soil. And so if the ground is unbroken, if there hasn't been any disturbance, then the stratigraphy will be very uniform as you go across the surface. But there'll be a huge change in density if there's been a hole dug for a burial. And so that's what we're picking up. It's also very helpful in historic context if you're looking for a house, for instance. And so a house foundation will be much denser than the soil around it. And so we'll be using this technology at Fort Carlton this summer to help the University of Saskatchewan Field School to identify where the buildings were and point them in the right direction of where to dig. We're also working with Métis Nation at the site of Nipawewin, which is the Bud Mission site, locating not just the cemetery, but there's a number of buildings there. And so the ground penetrating radar is very, very useful in figuring out what's there without digging, but also pointing you in the right direction. If you are going to dig, if you want to know where to dig, this can say, okay, this is where the storehouse is, this is where some houses were, and that's where you can start digging.
So the ground penetrating radar is actually, we have some photos that you've forwarded to us, is actually showing disturbances in the soil or items that are reflected back in the soil to the radar, and the equipment is identifying either disturbances in the soil or an object that's in the ground itself.
Yes. So essentially what it's doing is telling us the density of the soil. It's firing a radar beam into the soil, and it reflects on the various surfaces that it encounters and comes back. And so hard objects like a stone will come back very quickly, and it'll get a noticeable parabola that we can see on the screen. And then it slows down where it's less dense. What's really interesting at Nutana is we were able to visualize some of the graves in 3 dimensions. And so we could actually not only see this sort of soft pit feature that was dug for the burial, but within that, we were able to actually see a very dense rectangular object that has to be the coffin. And so that sort of thing is very, very exciting. And we're only able to see that very recently with the new software that we've got.
If you do find graves that are not marked and you're very confident that there is human remains under that surface area, would you have some process that the reserves or the government would then look at erecting monuments where those burials are, or what would be the plan post-discovery?
Yes, so CERNAC is in charge of all of that, and there are funds for both the discovery phase where survey is done, and we do our best to draw a map around those sites. Uh, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Winnipeg is working on school records to try to find the names of the missing children. And then there's also a program on commemoration where communities can get money from CERNAC and work with Parks Canada on creating whatever sort of monument or memorial that they deem fit for their community in that school.
I think it's a very sensitive way of dealing with that, trying to uncover and discover uh, what has happened in the past, but in some way to commemorate on a go forward basis. I think that's remarkable. How many are on your team? And I would imagine some of the students must be overjoyed in a way to get out of a classroom and into the field in these circumstances. How many are on your field and what are they doing?
So for this class, I've got 8 undergraduate students that have been out in the field, and a number of my graduate students who've been working on similar projects in different places in the province, and just want to get more familiar with the technology. And when we go other places, I work very closely with Dr. Keisha Supernaw, who's at the University of Alberta. We work collaboratively on a number of these ground penetrating radar projects, both in Alberta and Saskatchewan. One initiative that we've been trying to spearhead over the last couple of years is looking at Indigenous historic cemeteries. And so, as we were talking before we went on air, there are lots of small cemeteries around the prairies. And in the case of Indigenous cemeteries, there's a lot that had wooden crosses, and due to grass fires or whatever, not all of the graves are noticeable anymore. The tombstones are still visible, but many of them aren't. And if these cemeteries are still being used by the community, they don't know necessarily where they can bury more people. And so we've worked recently with Muscoday First Nation in Saskatchewan to help them to do GPR in their historic cemetery and try to tell them what's available and what is covered. And they can also put markers on the tombs that aren't currently marked. And so we're hoping to do that sort of across Saskatchewan, Alberta. We've got all of this equipment and we've got lots of students that want to learn how to use it. And we're just looking for ways that we can be a benefit to communities.
It's a perfect opportunity and great work by you and the team. And I wish you every success going forward. And thanks for all of your efforts making time for us today.
Thank you very much.
Stay with us, folks. We're coming right back.